So, hi everyone. I thought we'd spend some time and talk about the farming industry. And there is just so much. I feel like I'm so far behind on just understanding everything, and there's a lot of work to do. Okay, everyone, so let's get started. One of the things that you might discover is that there's not a whole lot of information, like when it comes to economics and the economy of agriculture. It's actually kind of difficult to find, even if you were to do a search for what is the percentage of the global economy that is agriculture. That search actually is a little difficult relative to some others. So we're going to jump right into the details and start to look at the global agriculture economy. So here's the kind of the global export map, and basically of the global economy, about $2 trillion of that is for agriculture. Let me check to see what the total global economy is, but essentially it's $2 trillion for agriculture. You see in the upper right hand corner there. Okay, so here's the actual graph for the global GDP, and one thing that I would say here is that there's a lot just in this graph. We're going to look at the agricultural graph as well, but this is from the World Bank data, and it's the latest data that they got even for 2020. And you see a couple things. So I guess perhaps the most important point is around 2002 or 3. That was perhaps the biggest change. So unfortunately, this isn't an exponential graph. And obviously, like back in the 1960s and, going from essentially a global GDP of, a couple trillion up to 1985, or 1980, basically, you have, 5 times change in the GDP. So, going from 10 to say today, that's an 8 times GDP, like global GDP difference, but that took 40 years versus the first 10 years. So certainly the 1960s to 1980s was a major change for the global, just what's been going on. But essentially since about 1985, and a lot of people were born around then, right? So basically what happened here is that the GDP went up by essentially 8 times factor globally. That's a big deal, right? So it's kind of hard to say, like there's a slight downturn. So for the first time in history, around 2008 there, you saw that major crash. So we might see something pretty major as well for 2020 with the coronavirus. And that looks like it only took maybe 1 or 2 years to recover, and after that it really kept with the same pace that it was before. But then more recently, around 2014, there was another pretty significant problem, right? And these are the first problems that we've ever seen with global GDP. So this might hint at some questions about population and other factors. So next, let's look at the agriculture-specific details. So what originally started this whole question was what is the size of the global economy, and what's the percentage of, like, how much does food make up that, what percentage is it of our global economy? So this kind of gives us an idea, right? So the global economy, according to that graph, is about say $80 trillion. About 3 trillion is with uh, food, right? So if you take 3 divided by 80, you get about 3.75%. So basically, you can say like 5%, somewhere between 3 and 5% of the global economy is food. So there's a project going on called the Atlas of Economic Complexity. I use this often. It's just really awesome, and you can see these are the total amount of exports. So the blue is trillion. The total shown here is 2 trillion. It's something doesn't quite make sense, uh, but anyway, you can kind of see the relative importance of food. So I've kind of like looked at this before, and Germany and Europe is actually quite high. And we're going to look at the specific numbers for each of these countries in a moment. But you can kind of see China is quite high there, America, Brazil, and then some areas in Africa. You kind of get some pretty good detail there to see what's going on for food. One very interesting surprise here is how important Turkey is. And yet it doesn't show that important, but yet it's very important strategically for food in that region. So this is kind of the graph here. There's a couple different versions of that. So basically, we're starting off with exports here, and you can kind of see, approximately half of the world's export, a little less than half of it, is coming from Europe, and that's in the blue there. And then kind of the second biggest area is Asia for exporting food. And there's a lot of details in here that you might be interested in, like facts that, like, why is Indonesia exporting more food than India, and so on, right? And then even Vietnam's role in this, and Thailand, right, and Malaysia, and then also Turkey is actually included in Asia, right? And it's actually very, very close to Europe, and in a lot of ways. Istanbul is closer to Central Europe than Moscow, right? So yet Russia is included in Europe. But it's important to look at each individual country here. You can see Mexico here, and North America in red, and then South America, with Brazil having about 4.6% of the total exports on Earth. It gives you kind of an interesting idea. You can see that basically America is the number one exporter of food on Earth. And then second is probably China, and then Germany, and these countries in Europe are very close together, like, right, Germany, Netherlands, and France, and collectively those guys are doing a lot of food. Like, so it doesn't really show you, because they're all bordering each other. They all have a lot of farmland. Well, some farmland, and they're doing a lot with food actually in that part of Europe. And then basically Brazil is really a significant factor. And then in Africa, you can kind of see South Africa, and maybe some surprises there. So if you're really interested in the details, you might want to check out the Atlas of Economic Complexity. It's pretty awesome. So this is the other side of the question, right? So it's on imports. So while Europe is exporting a lot of food, they're also basically needing to import the most, right? Almost as much in terms of value as all of Asia, and that's a kind of a big statement, right? It kind of says that the foods that are being imported and exported, Europe is not really doing such a good job on the import side. So maybe a lot of like reprocessing going on, or something like that, right? Like you see Hong Kong having a lot of imports here, for instance. Basically what this all means, at least to me, is that you see America here has 9.76% of the total is imported, right? And actually, we only export 8.86%. So actually, we have a food deficit, which is kind of ironic for the country that's actually has the most exports in terms of total amount. Something seems really bad about that, right? And China, you can see, is importing about 8%, 8.08%, and they were exporting about 7.2%, right? So, yeah, but basically, it looks a lot more consolidated. Like you can see, on the other graph, for exports, Australia shows up as an exporter, and they're actually on a positive side. So, there's just a lot of interesting things here. Like South Korea having to import a lot of food, and actually India not really importing that much. So actually India is doing a good job because they're exporting more food than they're importing. But China has some struggles there, right? So. And then also you see Saudi Arabia. It's pretty interesting to see Saudi Arabia if you've ever had a chance to look at the satellite imagery, kind of on the east side of Saudi Arabia near the UAE and Qatar and the Persian Gulf. If you zoom in, you'll see kind of some desert farming going on. And it looks, when I was comparing the size of the farms to the size of the cities, actually they got just as much farm as they do have a city. But yet you can see that they are importing a lot of food, at least just relatively speaking. Right. So, and anyway, so probably the details here, in terms of the gap for each individual country would be important to see over time as well. So basically, one thing you can kind of say is that the future of food probably depends on South America. They're doing something right down there. So basically, Latin America, South America, at least in the Western Hemisphere, these they have the biggest, they have a positive side. So, but the rest of the world basically is having some problems. And one last kind of detail here is that you see Oceania actually is the only other region that actually has more exports than imports in terms of agriculture and food. So Islands is actually thinking a lot about sustainability, and they're making things work good. So when I first discovered this website a few months back, this really changed my life. It really made me think a lot about the prices involved. I was actually studying milk at the time, and I was really interested in sugar, price of sugar over many years. And also, I live in kind of an area where they produce a lot of wheat. And different types of beans. Some of the beans aren't actually listed on here, but it was really cool just to see the prices, and then also kind of try to make sense of what was going on, right? So, for milk instance, it was kind of hard because they were trading each contract is like 200,000 pounds of milk, and I think what they do is they divide it up into smaller contracts. But the main contract is the one that you depend on. So basically, these symbols are listed here on the far right, and you can kind of look them up sometimes on different, stock search engine things. I did start to track milk and wheat and some others. So we want to kind of look at what the prices have been done here. But for each of these contracts, I think the contract is kind of divided up. You'd have to look at the details. I can try to explain some of that if you want. So I'll try to explain this as clearly as possible, how these contracts work, even though it's 200,000 pounds of grade A cow's milk. So basically, when we go to the store, we buy a gallon of milk for about $3.50 to $4. And I looked that up on the USDA, kind of the average price. They have some great statistics, really recent statistics, and track it very carefully, the price of milk. So, but basically, what happens is that in the normal stock market, futures are traded in what's called ticks. And they're these CWT things. So, and they're worth about $20 per contract. So, what is a CWT? So, one of these things are about 100 pounds to 112 pounds of milk, right? So let me just do a quick calculation here. So I just did this little calculation here, and 200,000 pounds of milk is approximately 23,000 gallons of milk. So what does that mean, right? So this tick size is how the commodities are traded. Obviously, no one can afford, well, few people can afford to buy a whole contract, which would be this 23,000 gallons of milk. And you'd kind of wonder on the quality too, right? That's just a huge amount. So basically what happens is they trade these tick sizes, and the tick sizes really depend on what the commodity is. So you might have a tick size for gold of 0.10 ounces. So you take the contract and you multiply it by 0.01, and then you get basically what the tick size is on the stock price. So here is the tick sizes for all the other commodities. So basically what this comes down to is knowing what the item is in terms of how many pounds or what's going on with the item, and then calculating what the tick size is and the relationship between that. So essentially what happens is that one tick typically is, at least in Europe and Asia markets, the tick size is 1/100th of 1%. So 1/100th and then another 1/100th, right? So that's equal to one tick, essentially, of the item. So you take the item, whether it's 200,000 gallons of milk, or say, for sugar, it might be 112,000 pounds of sugar. And for that, you basically take it, divide it by 100, and then you divide by 100 again. And then you basically get what the one contract is. So in that case, 112,000 divided by 100 equals, and then divide that by 100 again. And you basically got the contract size for one contract of sugar, right? And for that, basically, you can kind of start to estimate things. Hi, so this is actually one of my favorite data sets. I made the data set myself, and I trust it. So, and it's very complex, and it kind of, sometimes it's good to just look at absolutely everything and put it on one graph, and that's basically what I wanted to do. And a lot of people just haven't done that. They separate it by country, or, and basically we're looking at a lot of different regions, a lot of different countries here, all from the official World Bank data, and it's the latest data that I could find, and it's also the most comprehensive, going back to about 1960s. So there's a lot of data here, and a lot of things to kind of look at. So first thing that kind of that I noticed that kind of made me happy was that, in the 1990s, it looked like there was kind of a upswing in agriculture. And of all this data, that to me is some of the most interesting is there. Some of the most problems, in my view, is around 2012 and 2010. That area looks like there was a lot of loss actually in agriculture. So some of these countries, you can see in the 1960s and 70s, there was
perhaps a lot of the big agricultural gains in efficiency, um, at least in terms of global perspective of the things. You can see that approximately like 35% of the GDP of most of the countries outside of, say, Europe and North America, had about 30% of their total GDP. So that's an important number. The reason I really like this data is because it is a percentage of the GDP. So a lot of people, when they look at economics, essentially say, "Well, what's the country's GDP, and how's the GDP relative to the others?" But this is actually agriculture as a percentage of GDP. So if you're following what that means, for a given country, you could kind of say that 1 in 3 of the jobs, or one in 3 of the dollars generated all throughout the 1960s, 70s, 80s. Typically, you could find almost any place on the map, and that was the income of the person or the country, or most of the businesses. So you can see that a lot of that, there was a lot of turbulence. It may be that there's approximately 195 countries listed here in this graph. So you can kind of see that during around 1996 or so, that was where a lot of the turbulence. You can see it almost looked like it rose to about 40%, right? But you can see by around 2004, 2006 to 8. Most of the countries were around 15% of their total economy. The total GDP was in agriculture. So basically, this is why I love the data here from the World Bank. I don't know if even the United Nations Food Organization is keeping track of the data this well. So when I did just a search, this came up as the easiest and best source from the search engine. But anyway, here's the data. I hope you really liked it. Sorry, it's complex. I'm going to show a couple simplified graphs of the same version. So after kind of looking at all that data, I kind of broke it down into some countries that I was more interested in, and some of the larger countries, and also by population or GDP or just geographic significance. So you can kind of see that some of the countries have kind of really changed their levels by a couple percent every year, which is pretty significant. But there's still a lot of these countries even below 5% of their total GDP, right? So yeah, so here's kind of a quick review of that last graph, so you can kind of see a couple of the major flows going on with agriculture over the, I guess almost 60 years here. So.